So today we're going to talk about employer-sponsored visas. I hope to share with you important information that you need to know, that you need to be prepared for when you're potentially going to make an application under an employer-sponsored visa. We're going to talk about how you get an employer-sponsored visa and potentially how you can better position yourselves so you can be successful in obtaining an employer-sponsored visa. There's many different types of employer-sponsored visas, and here are just a few of them. Here are some common types of employer-sponsored visas. The 407 training visa is a useful visa for people who are looking to gain more experience. Potentially you might not have enough experience for one of the other visas, and so you might be able to use a 407 to gain more experience in order to lead on to another visa. The 408 COVID visa, look, the 408 COVID visa obviously wasn't a thing before COVID. 408 existed in another format, but the 408 COVID visa now allows employers in certain industries like healthcare, tourism and hospitality to easily sponsor someone at very low costs. It is only for people who are here in Australia at the moment, but it is a useful visa for some people. The 482 TSS visa is broken down into two streams, medium and short-term stream, and we'll spend a lot of time talking about the 482 visa today. It is a very popular type of visa. It is a temporary visa though, so if you're looking for a permanent visa, then the 186 is a useful permanent visa that people often use after being on a 482. And there's a regional visa, the 494 is a skilled employer-sponsored visa as well, and is helpful for people who live and work in the regions, and especially to those who are working in a short-term occupation. It's one of the few visas that does allow for permanent residency, or has a pathway to permanent residency if you're in the regions. So what's the most popular? As I said, the 482 is probably the most popular employer-sponsored visa. It's the one that is most commonly used by employers. The 482 replaced the old 457 visa in March 2018. And they are similar, they are very similar, but some major changes were made when they replaced the 457. And they're important changes that you need to be understanding of so that you prepare yourselves correctly for a 482 application and you don't do anything that might disadvantage you in the future. So the 482 visa does not have an age criteria. You can be of any age. You have to be over the age of 18, but there's no upper age limit. There are typically skill requirements on qualifications, although some occupations allow you to be qualified through experience only. All people applying for a 482 visa must have a minimum of 2 years work experience. That's regardless of what qualifications you might hold. You've got to have at least 2 years of experience which is relevant to your occupation. Some occupations for a 482 also require a skills assessment, so it's mandatory for some occupations to hold a skills assessment. We'll touch on that in more detail a bit later on. There is an English language criteria, so generally speaking, if you've done an IELTS exam and achieved a score of at least 5 across all 4 bands, then that will be sufficient. The IELTS test report must be no more than 3 years old at the time of application. You can be exempt. There are a number of exemptions for the English language criteria. One of those exemptions are for people who have had at least 5 years of full-time study where classes were taught in English. That's at secondary school level and at tertiary level. And I know many of our Filipino applicants have English language skills which were taught across the course of 5 years and are exempt on that basis. So that's a very helpful tip. And you must hold health insurance. So similar to the student visas, the 482 also requires you to hold health insurance. You don't have automatic access to the Medicare system here in Australia on this particular visa, so most people will need to hold health insurance. You can include your dependent family members on this visa, so Your spouse, your children up to the age of 23 can also be included on this particular visa. If anyone's got any questions about the criteria, feel free to jump in now. If I haven't touched on something that you were interested in, feel free to send us a message in the chat box. Denise, did you have a point?
Yes. So I was gonna just ask about the skills assessment. So what does that usually look like? Is that an exam, or is it just like something on paper that you've worked a certain number of years?
Yeah, look, skills assessments are different for all different occupations. So depending on what occupation you're applying under will depend on what type of skills assessment you do. Typically, all skills assessments require some form of paper evidence, whether that be your qualifications or your work experience. And we'll go into further detail on skills assessments in another slide. But it is an important factor for some occupations where they are mandatory. So what is required from the employer in order for them to sponsor you on a 482? So the employer must be offering you a full-time contract. The contract cannot be for a part-time role. They must pay you a salary that is in line with local labour market conditions, which means that they must pay you a salary or an income which is the same as they would pay an Australian worker or someone else in the local labour market. They can't underpay you. The employer must also pay a fee. There's a number of different fees that they must pay. One of those fees is the Skilling Australia Fund. This was one of the new introductions that were brought in when the 457 was removed and the 482 was then supplemented. The SAF is, we refer to it as the SAF, the Skilling Australia Fund. The SAF is calculated at either $1,200 per year or $1,800 per year, depending on the size of the employer. So if it's a large employer that turns over more than 10 million Australian dollars a year, then they pay $1,800 per year. The SAF is paid up front, depending on how many years the employer is nominating you for. So if they're nominating you for a full 4-year visa, and they're a large employer at $1,800 a year, then it's going to cost them 7,200 Australian dollars up front. So it is quite a considerable cost. You need to understand that the employer is making quite a large investment in you and in the visa. So it's important that both you and the employer understand technical requirements of the visa before you get started. The employer must, as I say, do a number of things before you can apply for a visa. They must apply for a standard business sponsorship agreement, or what we refer to as the SBS. Now, the SBS is a license. It's issued for 5 years, and a business must hold an SBS or must have applied for an SBS in order to sponsor someone in their particular business. Someone's just posted a question, is the SAF per employer or one-time registration for them? So it's per employee that they are nominating, so it's not a one-off. The SBS is a one-off for 5 years, but the SAF is for each particular employee that they are nominating. As I say, it's calculated on a per year basis and paid up front. After your employer has submitted their SBS, or if they already hold an SBS, then they can go ahead and nominate the occupation. The nomination fee is $330. And in the nomination, they must demonstrate that the position is genuine. They must provide evidence of how they advertise the position. We refer to the advertising as labour market testing, or LMT, and the labour market testing must be done in a particular fashion. They must advertise on at least 3 different websites, and the advertising must take place for at least 28 days, and that advertising must have happened in the past 4 months. The adverts themselves must contain certain information and content about the employer and about the position. If the adverts aren't done correctly, then they're deemed to be invalid, and it will cause problems for your application, and potentially you could be refused a visa if the LMT is not done correctly. Once the employer has done the nomination, they can then give to you the transaction reference number, or what we refer to as the TRN, and you can use the TRN to then input into your visa application so that the TRN, the nomination and the visa are all linked together. So can you become a permanent resident from the 482 visa? So I touched on this earlier. Yes, it is possible to become a permanent resident from a 482 visa, but you must be working in the medium to long-term skilled list. If you're on the short-term list, then you're not going to lead to permanent residency on a 482 visa. In order to qualify for permanent residency using the 482 visa, you must work with your employer for 3 years on that particular visa. You must be under the age of 45 when you apply for your permanent residency under 186. So that's another consideration that you need to make. So if you're applying for your first 482 visa and you're 43 years old, for example, then you're going to be over the age of 45 by the time you've worked for the employer for 3 years. So these are things that you need to factor into your decision making when you're looking to make an application for 482, deciding whether or not you will have a pathway to permanent residency. There are some exceptions to the rule when it comes to the age of 45. So some occupations are exempt from the age limit when qualifying for permanent residency, and some occupations are exempt depending on their income as well. Everyone, when applying for permanent residency, will need to pass the character test. Character test basically says that you will need to provide police checks from every country that you've lived in, where you've spent more than 365 days in the past 10 years. So you'll need to provide those police checks to the Department of Home Affairs. In order to pass the character test, you must not have been charged with an offence which resulted in an imprisonment of 12 months or more. If you've been convicted of an offence which resulted in a charge of more than 12 months imprisonment, then you will fail the character test. In addition, you need to also pass a health test, so everyone will attend a health examination. And again, you need to pass a health examination in order to be granted the visa. In this case, when transitioning from 482 to 186, you need to have passed an English language assessment. There are no exemptions in this particular stream. You must have had an English test which is at least IELTS 6 across all 4 bands.
And is it required that the English assessment is only IELTS, or can the other?
The other ones are admissible also. So you might have done Pearson's or Cambridge. So there's 4 or 5 different ones that you can elect to have used. Let's just use IELTS as an example, but the other ones are admissible as well.